Chapter 21. Under the cool cover of a hazy morning, the Crown Victoria drove up and out of the LA basin, and eventually dropped into the dry heat of the Central Valley. Hector, who was more hungover than he'd planned on, wished to go back to sleep as soon as they arrived in San Francisco. Frankie slept in the passenger seat, twitching through a dream. The car was packed tightly, full of clothing, books, electronics, and skateboard-related gear. He felt as though he missed Frankie already, like she was already leaving on her flight back home. The last time she'd slept this deeply was outside Las Vegas on the way to the Utah mountain. That stranger he'd met in the facelessness of the dark now twitched and snored beside him with ease. The first time he saw the bay with his own eyes, it had been from the back seat of an overcrowded Honda hatchback. This time he and Frankie watched it come into view as they exited the suburbs bordering the Central Valley and descended through tree-covered hillsides to Oakland. The sunlight and blue skies that accompanied their entire drive were now muted with the arrival of the bay's fog. Hector wished to grab a piece of the fog and take a bite. It had been a long drive, but in what seemed like a breath, they were joined on all sides by the traffic of the bay as they sped in the direction of the floating lights in the distance. They rolled down their windows as the Bay Bridge's combination of wind and fog produced the sensation that felt like flying. Across the bridge, the glowing haze of the high-rises welcomed them to the peninsula, where the sky, the city, and the Pacific Ocean were an intermixing blur. The Presidio house was on a hillside, with the orange glow of the Golden Gate Bridge close by. A key was hidden for Hector under the mat, and they unpacked the essentials they needed and left the remaining bags in the Crown Victoria. She stayed for 3 days. In these 3 days, they traversed the peninsula on foot, on bikes, and on the Muni and the BART. Mostly, though, they skated. They skated all over the place until she departed for the airport. October nights in other sections of the city were some of the warmest of the year. But the Presidio, with its courtside views of the bay's opening to the Pacific, stayed gray and wet. On one afternoon, walking through the Legion of Honor Museum, Hector glared at sculptures and busts that felt too alive for him to relax in their presence. The rain tapped loudly on the museum skylights from hall to hall and wing to wing. After retrieving his jacket from the coat check, he layered it over his hoodie. Gold lights and blue sky surprised him outside the exit doors as drops of water fell from the treetops to the bushes and pavement. The golden hour conditions hit him with the idea to walk home through the Presidio hills and trees. And with an incoming gust of wind from the Pacific that gently pushed him into a step down through an empty gathering of trees along a muddy trail, he heard something that he'd hoped would be somewhere in these woods. The foghorn's drone blanketed the empty hillside. When it ceased, Hector stood alone in the silence of the trail above the bay. The silence was followed by the sound of the piano and the violin he'd heard every Friday and Sunday night as a child. Playing the first movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, the rendition played gently as Hector began a careful and hurried pace in an attempt to get closer to it. The sky was purple and dark blue as the trees opened to another small meadow. The atmosphere erupted as the two instruments he knew so well were then joined by the accompaniment of what would only be an entire orchestra, playing the final minutes of his favorite section powerfully and at such a pace that Hector knelt and allowed the rush of the notes and surroundings to circulate through his body and out of his feet and hands and head. His father's swift violin astride his mother's piano playing, so full of power and grace. And then everything was silent and dark again. The last of the purple and blue daylight was gone. A new fog had arrived accompanied by misty rain. The atmosphere was windy and cool. His eyes remained closed, his body at rest. When he opened his eyes, he felt the rain tapping and popping off his jacket collar to his neck. He continued through the dark and the trees until the sidewalk reflected the streetlights again, and then he was home. The end.